Okay, so in this video, I'm going to discuss the idea of resonance, which is central to understanding a large number of organic chemistry concepts. So first, with the definition, resonance is the delocalization of pi electron density. And delocalization first, of course, means the spreading out of or the sharing of electron density over multiple atoms. And specifically, electron density that is pi is that which is housed in p orbitals and shared between p orbitals that are parallel to one another. For example, if you have a lone pair in a p orbital and that shares with an empty p orbital that is adjacent, then we say that these two p orbitals are conjugated, or they are parallel and pi bonding. So conjugated p orbitals or continuous parallel p orbitals are going to be a necessary requirement for being able to experience resonance delocalization